Let's put the women and children to bed and go looking for dinner. John Rothstein here on Inside College Basketball Now. We continue with our preseason content for the 25-26 college basketball season. As I've been saying, we are going to be doing lots of different preseason content, getting you set for the upcoming year in college basketball. Want to remind you to subscribe to Inside College Basketball Now on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. We want to be your Bible for the college basketball season and beyond. We are the only college basketball podcast coming to you 52 weeks out of the calendar year. Now, on this very episode, we are going to tackle 5 teams on the rise entering the 25-26 college basketball season. I'm going to go through 5 teams, 5 programs that I think are on an upward trajectory, going to break them down soup to nuts, where they are as a program, and also what their status is for 25-26. And if you're talking about teams that are on the rise, you have to talk about the St. John's Red Storm. That is where we will start this list. St. John's last season, its second season under Rick Pitino, had an incredible journey. St. John's, prior to last year, had not won an NCAA tournament game since 2000. That was also the last year that St. John's won the Big East tournament. And St. John's had not won an outright Big East regular season title since 1985, which was the year that this program went to the Final Four under Lou Carnesecca. Those things were accomplished last season. Not the Final Four, but St. John's under Rick Pitino, who was the Big East Coach of the Year and the Naismith Coach of the Year, won the Big East regular season title outright, won the Big East tournament title for the first time in a quarter century, and also earned a 2 seed in the NCAA tournament. Now, St. John's lost to Arkansas in the round of 32. A disappointing finish, no doubt, but it was interesting to me. So much is always dictated, as it should be, in terms of the vibe of a season based on where a team finishes in the NCAA tournament. And if you're a high seed, and I've talked about this with coaches throughout my career covering college basketball, it's very hard to feel great about a season if you don't advance to the second weekend of the NCAA tournament. Now, obviously, teams that believe they have a chance to go to the Final Four and win a national championship, that's always the goal. But normally, if you're a coach and you make it to the second weekend, you know you were one of 16 teams to do so. You know you had a great year. St. John's didn't accomplish that, and it was an opportunity for this program to get back to the second weekend of March Madness for the first time since 1999. But that did not deflate the momentum that this program built last season. St. John's was not a program that a lot of people looked at with anything except apathy for 25 years. There was pockets of success under Steve Lavin. There was some pockets of success under Chris Mullen, but not until Rick Pitino last year really reinvigorated St. John's with a 31-win season was St. John's a national force. And I can tell you right now that St. John's entering this season isn't just a national force from a personnel perspective. St. John's has unequivocally the best roster in college basketball. That doesn't mean that St. John's is going to have the best team in college basketball. But man for man, Rick Pitino has put together a blue chip type roster in Queens. Now, the head of the snake is Zuby Ejiofor, who if you followed us here on Inside College Basketball Now and watched our Big East offseason breakdown, I named as my Big East preseason player of the year. I also think he is going to be a candidate for the National Defensive Player of the Year in 25-26. That is your anchor. And then 5 other transfers make up what I believe is unequivocally the top 6 in college basketball when you look at 1 through 6 in a rotation. Ian Jackson from North Carolina, Joe Zonsanen from Arizona State, Ozziah Sellers from Stanford, Bryce Hopkins from Providence, Dylan Mitchell from Cincinnati, and Zuby Ejiofor. That core of 6 players is going to get the lion's share of the minutes and also of the production for St. John's this year. There are major question marks for this program and this team at point guard. There's no denying that. Rick Pitino came out earlier in August and said that St. John's is not going to play with a traditional point guard. St. John's had 3 players last year Simeon Wiltshire, Kadari Richmond, and Davon Smith, who could all comfortably play point guard. This team does not have a traditional point guard. The most traditional would be Dylan Darling, a mid-major transfer from Idaho State. But beyond that, when you look at sheer talent, when you look at the player-for-player abilities of this St. John's team is vastly more talented than the team last year that won 31 games and was a 2 seed in the NCAA tournament. Now, this is what I'm going to say, because the point guard situation is going to be a common theme all year, especially if this team loses games. But this is what I'm going to say. Rick Pitino, throughout the course of his Hall of Fame career, has not always needed the best talent to win. This year, he is unequivocally the best talent. And when you have the best talent in the sport, and you have a coach that has been at the apex of the sport for 3 decades right now, because if we're being fair, in the modern era of college basketball, Rick Pitino and Mike Krzyzewski have clearly been the best coaches of this generation. And if you're looking all time in college basketball, it's John Wooden, Mike Krzyzewski, and Rick Pitino. Rick Pitino is a coach that has not always needed blue chip personnel to go far in the NCAA tournament. Rick Pitino has blue chip personnel this year. He may not have a traditional point guard. There is no Peyton Siva on this roster. There is nobody to set the table and run an offense like an old school throwback point guard. But when you have a coach this capable and you have a roster this capable, I would be shocked if St. John's won fewer than 25 games entering the Big East tournament. Now, what does that mean? St. John's is going to play a formidable schedule. There are games against 3 SEC teams. Alabama at Madison Square Garden on Saturday, November 8th. That is the first Saturday of the college basketball season. Ole Miss on December 6th at Madison Square Garden. And also a game against Kentucky in the CBS Sports Classic on December 20th in Atlanta. St. John's will also play in the Players Era Festival in Las Vegas. Iowa State and Baylor are confirmed opponents. The third opponent is to be determined. That's a pretty hefty schedule. St. John's is also going to be, obviously, a part of 20 Big East games. But I got to tell you, the Big East, and I've said this time and time again, is a big question after St. John's, UConn, and Creighton. And if you're looking at the rest of the league right now, I'm not saying St. John's can't lose, but I think at minimum, St. John's is going to win 16 Big East regular season conference games. So the way things are being sliced, and I know that obviously they're going to play a really tough non-conference schedule, I would be surprised if St. John's goes into the Big East tournament with anything worse than a 25-6 record. Got to remember last year, this was a team that won 31 games and went 27-4 prior to the Big East tournament. Won the Big East tournament, entered the NCAA tournament at 30-4, and then finished the season at 31-5 after obviously a memorable season. So if you're looking at St. John's now, you've got the best roster in the sport. You've got a coach that's one of the 3 best college coaches of all time, along with Krzyzewski and Wooden. It's very unlikely that St. John's does not see this thing to a 25-plus win season. Now, is St. John's going to be able to get to a Final Four, to get to an Elite Eight? We don't know that because there are so many variables in the NCAA tournament. Matchups, you need great health. You might face, obviously, a different type of defense, which could expose a weakness personnel-wise of a team. But I would be shocked, I would be flabbergasted if St. John's does not at least get to a 25-6 record heading into the Big East tournament. The second team on our list for 5 teams on the rise entering the 25-26 season is the BYU Cougars. And how can BYU not be on the rise? Last year, year 1 under Kevin Young, a head coach who came from the NBA after Mark Pope did an outstanding job with the Cougars before he opted to become the head coach at his alma mater, the University of Kentucky. Kevin Young took BYU all the way to the Sweet 16. Round 1 win over VCU, round 2 win over Wisconsin. A big time effort by BYU last year. And that was a BYU team that, again, was able to return Richie Saunders, an all Big 12 caliber player and a potential preseason All-American, and Keba Keita, who was obviously a mainstay for this program last year in the pivot. But the additions are what has raised the ceiling in Provo. AJ DeBansa, who is firmly in the conversation to be the number 1 overall pick in the 2026 NBA draft, is the headline act. But Baylor transfer Rob Wright is another guy that, again, will be a major, major force at point guard. And if Rob Wright stayed at Baylor, we would be talking about Rob Wright potentially as one of the breakout players in college basketball this season for Scott Drew. Why we're not seeing that as much since he transferred to BYU, because all the hype right now is around AJ DeBansa when you look at BYU's newcomers. I'm not saying that Rob Wright is going to overshadow AJ DeBansa, but if there is gas in the engine right now for the Cougars, it's going to be Rob Wright. And Kevin Young is going to have to deal and manage that when you think about the expectations that are going to be swirling right now around this basketball team. This is the most anticipated season in BYU basketball history. Now, people could say, what about when Jimmer Fredette was returning for his final year? What about other seasons for BYU? Like a couple of years ago when the Cougars were transitioning from the West Coast Conference to the Big 12 under Mark Pope. It doesn't compare. Kevin Young got this program to a Sweet 16 in his first season as head coach. If you accomplish that before you add AJ DeBansa and Rob Wright, the bar is only going to go up. And if you're a BYU fan, if this is the season of your lifetime, if this is the season you've been salivating over, anything less than a trip to the Elite Eight is going to be a massive disappointment in Provo. Not going to be a failure, but it would be a massive disappointment because you've already gotten to a Sweet 16 with Kevin Young as your head coach. And now you're adding 2 big-time talents in Wright and DeBansa. And the thing I love about BYU, major showcase games out of the gate. In November, BYU will open the season in Las Vegas against Villanova. BYU will also go cross-country to TD Garden to take on UConn on a Saturday night in November. That, of all the games we're seeing non-conference-wise in college basketball, might be the game that I'm looking forward to the most. I love the vibe of a UConn game in Boston, especially after UConn played Illinois a couple of years ago in the Elite Eight. You have that on the docket if you're BYU. BYU is going to play 2 games in the ESPN Events Invitational with Dayton, Miami, and Georgetown. That's another good opportunity. There's also going to be a game at the Delta Center against Wisconsin in Salt Lake City in an NCAA tournament rematch, plus a matchup with Clemson in the Jimmy V Classic at Madison Square Garden. BYU, since I've been doing this, has always been a proud program. Under Dave Rose, who was a great coach, Mark Pope, who is now the head coach of Kentucky, and now Kevin Young. But BYU was never getting these types of non-conference opportunities. UConn in Boston, Wisconsin coming to Salt Lake City, Villanova on opening night in Las Vegas. Even if this isn't vintage Villanova, if BYU is going to be playing in a doubleheader with Arizona and Florida, the defending national champions, this is the type of dream season that BYU fans have been dreaming about for quite some time. You are living right now in the golden era of BYU basketball. Last season, you went to the Sweet 16. You keep Saunders, you keep Keita, you had Wright, you had DeBansa. You have a team and you have a program in BYU that should legitimately dream about playing in the 2026 Final Four. Third on the list, the Louisville Cardinals. Louisville last year was brought back to respectability by Pat Kelsey. 27 wins, a 19-game improvement from the last year under Kenny Payne. Came up short against Creighton in the NCAA tournament. But the goal now in the 502 is different. The goal in the 502 is to be a team that advances in the NCAA tournament. And when you look at what Louisville added in terms of off-season additions, I don't know if there's a team in the sport that bolstered its perimeter like Louisville did. And you have to start with five-star freshman Michael Brown. There are certain freshmen that are going to take a major chunk out of the apple. They're not going to take a nibble and get better. They are going to take a gargantuan bite. That is what Michael Brown is going to do for Louisville in 25-26. He is somebody that will make every single game that is played at the KFC Yum Center appointment television. But looking at the way this roster was constructed, I love the shooting that Louisville surrounded Brown with. Ryan Conwell has made in excess of 100 three-point shots during one of his seasons in college basketball. Isaac McNeely from Virginia. Adrian Woolley from Kennesaw State. And also Kobe Rogers, who played for Pat Kelsey at Charleston and redshirted last year. There is nothing but shooters around Louisville. And then you're going to get back Kason Pryor, who missed most of last season with an ACL tear. Ali Khalifa, who transferred from BYU, is also going to be part of the front court mix along with Javon Hadley. Louisville on paper looks like a team that can challenge Duke for an ACC regular season title and be a top 16 protected seed in the NCAA tournament. And this is another thing I love about Pat Kelsey. He ducks nobody when it comes to scheduling. Now, bourbon is something that is extremely popular in Louisville. I remember talking to an assistant coach at Louisville a couple of years ago, and he said, John, the biggest thing I learned, these people here, they love basketball and they love bourbon. And I wonder a little bit how much the staff was drinking when they put together this non-conference schedule. Because I'll say this, it feels like every other game on Louisville's non-conference schedule could be a round of 32 NCAA tournament game or better. Kentucky at the KFC Yum Center. Cincinnati in downtown Cincinnati. At Arkansas as part of the ACC SEC Challenge. Indiana at Gainbridge Fieldhouse in Indianapolis. A home series starting against Memphis. At Tennessee, who under Rick Barnes is always a consensus top 25 team. And then there will be a game in Fort Worth against Baylor in February to break things up during ACC play. You are looking at a team in Louisville that is built, in my opinion, to win multiple games in the NCAA tournament. And I want to make sure that I use this example right now as a potential parallel between Louisville and Florida last year. One of the big questions entering last season surrounding Florida was how would this nucleus, who had never won a game together in the NCAA tournament, do in March Madness? Florida went on to win the national championship. I'm not saying now before the season that Louisville is going to win the national championship, but if you told me that similar to Florida, Louisville was going to go from a program that had no NCAA tournament wins the year prior to one that won multiple NCAA tournament games and maybe 3 or 4 in 2026, I wouldn't hesitate. Louisville is a bona fide contender to challenge Duke for an ACC regular season title and earn a high seed in the NCAA tournament in 2026. This is the most anticipated season that Louisville's basketball program has had since the 1920 season when Chris Mack was the head coach and the Cardinals entered most preseason rankings as the number 1 team in college basketball prior to COVID shutting down the 2020 NCAA tournament. I'm John Rothstein here on Inside College Basketball Now. We have given you 5 teams on the rise entering the 25-26 season. We will give you the other 2 after this.
When you need your sports news all the time,
we've got breaking news to bring to you.
CBS Sports HQ gives you a snapshot of all the sports that matter to you. When you need your sports in a snap, find it on CBS Sports HQ. Streaming free anywhere you are.
All right, the 4th team on my teams on the rise entering the 25-26 season is the Michigan Wolverines. And Michigan made a major impression last year in its first season under Dusty May, winning the Big Ten tournament, going to the Sweet 16, losing to Auburn in Atlanta. And now Michigan enters this season with legitimate hopes and aspirations to make the Final Four and compete for a national championship in year 2 under Dusty May. And here's the thing about Dusty May, which I think he really reiterated last year in his first season as a head coach in a power conference. He is very capable of turning over a roster and putting it together in very quick and timely form. He did it last year. He got Trey Donaldson. He got Vlad Golden, who he brought from Florida Atlantic. He got Danny Wolf, and he pieced those players around Roddy Gale, Namari Burnett. Just a really fun team last year at Michigan that played great offense with two bigs together. And again, had great success winning the Big Ten tournament and then winning multiple games in the NCAA tournament, coming up short against Auburn in the Sweet 16. But the goals, especially for May, who has already coached in a Final Four at Florida Atlantic, are bigger than that. And Michigan is going to be bigger than most teams in college basketball because, in my opinion, the Wolverines have the deepest and potentially most potent front line in the sport with veteran Will Cheddar, UCLA transfer Adai Mara at 7'3", Morez Johnson, a transfer from Illinois, and Yaxel Lendeborg from UAB. Those four players are going to be, in my opinion, the deepest and potentially most productive front line in the sport. And Dusty May was also able to retain, in addition to Will Cheddar, Roddy Gale, Namari Burnett, a burgeoning glue guy in the sport, and also LJ Kaysen, who I think can make a major jump this season as a potential reserve. And then North Carolina transfer Elliot Cadeau will take over at point guard for Trey Donaldson, who transferred to Miami. Michigan has more upside than it did a year ago. Michigan also has, in my opinion, a rotation that's going to be as good as any in the sport. There's a number of also talented freshmen that Dusty May brought in, led by Trey McKinney, a top 30 prospect. But I think if you're looking now at a team that has the requisites to be the top challenger to Purdue in the Big Ten, it's the team from Ann Arbor. And Michigan, just like a lot of these other teams, is going to play big time competition early, starting with an exhibition game against St. John's at Madison Square Garden in the preseason. Michigan plays Wake Forest in Detroit. It will also go on the road to take on TCU, a sneaky good team coached by Jamie Dixon. In the Players Era Festival, Michigan has San Diego State and Auburn guaranteed. The third game is to be determined. And then there's going to be a game against Villanova and Ann Arbor on December 9th, the start of a home-and-home series, and then a massive game in February against Duke in Washington, D.C., a non-conference game similar to the one that Duke played against Illinois last season. But looking now at Michigan and the makeup of the roster, Cadeau, Gale, Burnett, Lendeborg, Johnson, Mara, Cheddar off the bench, Kaysen off the bench. From a role allocation perspective, Michigan's team fits together like a great meal. Everything is properly aligned. And I think if you're a Michigan fan right now, or if you're Dusty May, anything less than the second weekend of the NCAA tournament would be a major disappointment, because this team, in my opinion, is going to play all season long with a number next to its name that could be in single digits. Michigan, to me, is a top 5 team to start this season. And the fifth and final team on our list of programs that are on the rise is the San Diego State Access. And look, I don't throw this around lightly. San Diego State was in the national championship game, 2 years ago in 2023, lost to UConn. For years, Brian Dutcher and Steve Fisher had talked about being in a situation where they could go to a Final Four and be in a situation where they can compete for a national championship. They did that. The next year, San Diego State went to the Sweet 16. But last year, San Diego State was in Dayton and missed out on an opportunity to play in the first round of the NCAA tournament beyond the first four. And a lot of people forget a major reason for that was because Reese Waters, a valuable veteran guard, missed the entire season with a foot injury. Reese Waters is now back for San Diego State, and he is going to take immense pressure off players like Miles Byrd, who really flirted with the NBA draft process, who really thought about keeping his name in the draft. He comes back as a bona fide Mountain West Player of the Year candidate, along with Magoon Guath, last year's Mountain West Rookie of the Year, Freshman of the Year, and also Defensive Player of the Year. Those are three players, in my opinion, Waters, Byrd, and Guath, that could all earn Mountain West Player of the Year's honors. And if you're the Mountain West Player of the Year, you were obviously good enough to be a factor in March Madness. Now, Guath is the player that I think could become an absolute star during the 25-26 season. I'm always looking for players who had a nice cup of coffee as a freshman and are looking for a bigger piece of the meal as a sophomore. Guath is somebody who I've watched in practice. I've studied his game closely. His first year in the Mountain West, he's the Mountain West Defensive Player of the Year, and he's the Mountain West Freshman of the Year. A big jump is coming for this guy. Brian Dutcher also brings back a number of players who earned time in the rotation last year. B.J. Davis, Farrell Compton, Taj DeGorville, but there's also some transfers that I know that this program is exceptionally high on. Sean Newman from Louisiana Tech is the type of table-setting point guard that should see a lot of time. Latrell Davis from San Jose State is a proven scorer in the Mountain West, and also Jeremiah Oden is a player from Charlotte who has played in a number of different programs, but also brings high major experience, played at DePaul also earlier in his career. I think you can make the case, given the landscape of other dynamics in college basketball. St. Mary's losing a couple of guys, obviously, Augustus Marshallonis and Jordan Ross. Memphis losing a lot. Gonzaga reshuffling its backcourt. I'm not saying San Diego State is going to 100% get this title, but in my opinion, it would not shock me if at the end of this season, San Diego State separates itself as the best non-power conference team in college basketball. Refurbished point guard play with Sean Newman. 3 potential Mountain West Player of the Year candidates in Miles Byrd, Reese Waters, and Magoon Guath. And again, a program that has an identity of defense and rebounding. And as somebody who has sat in San Diego State's practices multiple times at Viejas Arena, the number one thing that is always going to be stressed and focused on for the San Diego State Aztecs is going to be limiting the opponent to second shots and playing great defense. And I remember I was at a practice last year, and Brian Dutcher was working with his team, and he stopped practice, and he said, the only statistic where it's okay to be selfish in basketball is rebounding. And if San Diego State has more offense, thanks to better point guard play, thanks to Reese Waters coming back, San Diego State is going to win a lot of games. San Diego State right now with a number of major opportunities. They are in the Players Era tournament as well. If you remember last year, San Diego State was able to beat Houston and also Creighton in helping the Aztecs get in that large bid. San Diego State will play Michigan and Oregon in its first 2 games. The third game is to be determined. And San Diego State will also play against Arizona on a neutral court on December 20th in Phoenix. So those are major opportunities for the Aztecs, not just to think about getting to the NCAA tournament, but with a team like this, playing for seeding as well. We have to see what happens. San Diego State under Brian Dutcher has had great teams over the last half decade. Think about the team in 2020 that was probably going to be a 1 seed in the NCAA tournament if it wasn't canceled for COVID. There was the team in 2021 that was a 6 seed in the NCAA tournament. People forget it, but the Aztecs lost to Syracuse in the first round. Obviously, the 2023 team that went to the national title game and the 2024 team as well that went to the Sweet 16 and lost to UConn. But you got 5 teams on the rise entering the 25-26 college basketball season. St. John's, BYU, Louisville, Michigan, and San Diego State. Couple of teams, the Aztecs and the Cougars, who were both in non-power conferences and dueling it out in the Mountain West during that 10-11 season when Jimmer Fredette went with BYU all the way to the Sweet 16, lost to Florida, and San Diego State went to the Sweet 16 and lost to the eventual national champion UConn Huskies. San Diego State, BYU, St. John's, Michigan, Louisville, your 5 teams on the rise for the 25-26 college basketball season. Want to remind you to subscribe to Inside College Basketball now on both Apple and Spotify. I'm John Rothstein, reminding you again that we are the only college basketball podcast coming to you 52 weeks out of the calendar year. Once again, I'm John Rothstein, and this is Inside College Basketball Now.